Hi guys, so today we're going to be talking about attachment and development, and we're going to be specifically talking about caregiver and infant interactions. This is the beginning of your attachment topic, so it's quite important to get the foundations of this down. So within this unit we will be talking about how different types of attachment affect our development, how the different theories of attachment have come about. Some of them definitely are more in favour than others, but as with everything in psychology, this is a hotly debated topic. So hopefully by the end of this video you will be able to understand the nature and purpose of adult interactions, to be able to use key terms, and again you need to add these to your glossaries as you go along please, and to describe and evaluate research evidence on this topic. So there will again be some key studies within this PowerPoint, so please make a note of those as you go through, and again please feel free to pause the slides and make a note of those if needs be. So what is attachment then? Here we've got some pictures of attachment potentially. It is kind of that lovey-doveyness that we try and associate with really strong bonds. But particularly what we're talking about in this unit is that it's a particular type of bond. It's between the child, it's between the primary caregiver. Often that is thought to be the mother, but it has now expanded into fathers, grandparents, siblings, etc, etc. However, for most of this topic we will be talking about the mother, so that is not to be sexist. This is mainly because most of the research focuses between the infant and the mother. So there's a few key terms in here as well. So it's characterised by that reciprocal mutual affection, so that the infant and the mother both feel this attachment. It isn't one way, and there's frequent interaction. So often the mother and the infant, they will seek this interaction, they want to interact with each other, and there is a desire to be close to each other, and that there is also this desire to be close proximity, and it's selective as well. So the child will prefer to be with his caregiver than strangers by anyone else. It's a nice strong bond, it's enduring, and it is between two people. So this does evolve into adult relationships, this does evolve into friendships, etc. But for most of this topic we will be talking about infant and caregiver. So attachment then. Schaefer defined this as a close emotional relationship between two persons. It's characterised by mutual affection and a desire to maintain proximity, which is what we discussed in the previous slide. When you are attached to someone else, it's nice to be in their company. You won't feel anxious with them. You want to seek proximity to them because they are your safe space. And there is a YouTube clip that you can watch at your leisure as well, and try and demonstrate this. So what does this look like? Makobi from 1980 identified these 4 characteristics of attachment. These are: number 1, seeking proximity; number 2, this distress on separation; number 3, joy on reunion; and 4, orientation behaviour. So probably most of those are self-explanatory. The only one that may be causing you a little bit of issues is the orientation of behaviour. So orientation behaviour is that behaviours are directed at each other, okay? They're not just out into the ether, they're directed at each other. So what does this mean? It means that the early attachments we form are really important in terms of our development. These will form a lot of the bases of our relationships, and this means that these are very important in that respect. That attachments have to be reciprocal, that both people have to be involved. It can't just be this unrequited love, okay? It has to be both people involved, and therefore to build these bonds you need to have interactions. So there is this thing called interactional synchrony, and we're going to have a closer look at that just now. So what does that look like? Interactional synchrony and reciprocity get confused as terms, okay? So it's really important that you stop and you define these and you get these straight in your head. So interactional synchrony is where they're mimicking each other. So you can see here that the baby and the mum are pulling the same face. You can see the dad and the baby here are also pulling the same face, whereas reciprocity is more this, it's more like a conversation, okay? So baby smiling, mum smiles back. Baby's not sure, mum's not sure. So it's a conversation rather than just this mimic. So they are very similar. I can see why students get confused, but this is quite important to make sure you try not to get them confused, okay? So just bear that in mind if we get some questions on that. So, how do we have these interactions between caregivers and infants? Well, it's really important to remember that infants cannot speak, so therefore non-verbal communication is so important. Newborn babies in general are pretty useless. No offense to the babies out there, but they are pretty useless. They can't feed themselves, they can't protect themselves, so they have some primitive reflexes, so things like grasping, suckling, etc. But they also produce these social releases, so that is what the ... is meant to be. So social releases like smiling, and it gives the caregivers a reason to respond to the infant. And this very early communication is based around the fact that babies cry, and these cries vary. If you don't have any children, or you've not been around children, you won't be able to hear that. This is very much a thing. And therefore that is what the interaction is based upon. So it is mainly the adult responding to baby. So a lot of the research that we're going to discuss comes from the 1970s, okay? So it is like a conversation, like I said earlier, and these are reciprocal because we need to have these interactions from each other. So they move in a rhythm, and it's kind of like a little bit of a dance. Okay, so having this rhythm in these interactions, and that baby smiles, then mum smiles back, etc., etc. And this is thought to be a precursor to conversation. So it is the case that someone will say something and then you respond. You don't try and interrupt them usually, and that you're able to respond in that manner, and it allows you to anticipate people's conversation. There's recent research that I was listening to, and that the gaps between conversations are less than a second. So if you pause for too long, like so, then it's uncomfortable. There is not this gap in conversation, so this is meant to be the precursor to that. And it's very important, obviously, for the development of social and language skills. So, what's some research on this then? All of a bit of research. So, one example of this is reciprocity. So, smile on one person makes the other person smile. Person who is the main man in this is Tronik et al., 1992. So, that's kind of little babies from my sort of age range, and what he did was he asked mums who had been enjoying smiling and interacting with their babies to suddenly stop, okay? So to make it static, to have this very frozen face, and the baby would get really confused by this, so they would try and get mum to interact with them, but when mum didn't respond, they'd get really puzzled, they'd get really distressed. And you can see this in the videos here. So this one's quite good if you don't feel like you've got a lot of time, and this one's good if you feel like you've got a bit more time, but probably worth watching both if you're so inclined. There's pretty much the same thing, just slightly different angles. So there is a slightly different interaction as well, where we've got interactional synchrony. So this is the mirror pattern, so we will mimic each other exactly, okay? So it does involve emotions as well, and Feldman described it as like something that is a little bit more complicated, so the temporal coordination of micro-level social behaviour. So Meltzoff and Muir, in 1977, they observed interactional synchrony in infants as well, and this is their study. So some original photos from this, and an adult gave a really distinctive facial gesture to a baby, and see if he copied it. So here's a tongue sticking out, here is mouth open, here is pursed lips, and you can see little babies trying to mimic that. And this has been replicated with newborn infants, so like a couple of hours, couple of minutes old. This has been replicated. So the children's response was filmed and identified by independent observers. So why is that important? It's important because we want to avoid inter-rater or inter-observer bias. We want to avoid that, so therefore it's really important that it's independent. And then they were able to replicate this with babies who were only a few days old, and again this video demonstrates that. Further research, so further support for this. Isabella et al. Found that securely attached infants, which is something we will look at later on in the course, had shown more instances of interactional synchrony, and it suggests that stronger emotional bonds were associated with higher levels of synchrony. And Hyman in 2001 also was able to show that there's better quality of relationship as well at this 3 months. But of course, with a lot of issues in terms of dealing with infants so young, this isn't clear whether it's cause or effect, or whether it's just a coincidence. So what are the problems with testing them? There are obviously some major problems in working with infants. Not only ethical reasons, but in terms of that, is this just a coincidence? Is this just happening and it's a misinterpretation on our part? And it's also very difficult to kind of work out what's going on from the infant's perspective. Is it conscious? Is it deliberate? And we cannot know for certain what these behaviours mean, and do they actually have this special meaning that we are attributing to it? However, there are some good points about this too. So these are controlled observations. They take place in a controlled environment, so we're able to control the extraneous variables a lot more. So observations are generally very well controlled. They're both mum and baby are being filmed. Lots of angles, very fine details, can be recorded and analysed much later. Babies don't usually care either about whether they are being observed, so it doesn't change. There's no demand characteristics in that respect, so that's pretty good too. So it means that this research has good validity, that it is actually measuring what we think it's measuring in terms of their behaviour. But it doesn't really answer the question about why infants form these attachments. So there's a lot of biological reasons that we can attribute to this. So infants themselves are very physically helpless. Like I said, they are a little useless earlier in the PowerPoint. They have this innate ability to seek interactions with other individuals. They don't want to be alone. They offer short-term security, so short-term protection from this. And long-term, this gives a template for later relationships, and it gives us a model of how to behave, which will be very, very important. A lot of these were put forward by Bowlby, who we will discuss later on in the topic. There you go, there's Bowlby. So he suggested that these interactions formed an internal working model, and basically this is a mental representation of how relationships should work. Okay, so if you have positive relationships with your caregiver, then you are more likely to form a positive representation of the world. And unfortunately, if you have negative interactions, then you are likely to form a negative representation of the world as well. So this will be very important later on when we look at the rest of the attachment topic. So back to thinking about Schaefer and Emerson, they discovered some stages in the development of attachment as well. So caregiver and infant interactions are the very start of this. So Schaefer and Emerson did this really big classical study into how attachments are formed. And they concluded that there are several stages which are very important in the development of attachment. So this is a longitudinal study, very, very large, and they followed these babies for the first 2 years of their life. 60 infants, which is a huge sample compared to other studies. Working class infants in Glasgow from when they were about a year old and then at 18 months. and they were observed every 4 weeks, which is quite intense. So they measured the attachment by separation protest, which is the baby being left alone with other people, basically being away from mum, and stranger anxiety. So when the researcher approached the infant and had a look to see how they were reacting, so they found that the first signs of attachment were happening at around 25 to 32 weeks, that they started showing the separation anxiety, the stranger anxiety. And fear of strangers happened about a month later. So these are very, very closely linked in terms of development of attachment. And the intensity of attachment peaked 1 month after it first appeared. So this is the same time as the fear of strangers happening. So you become very intensely attached to the caregivers, and they're also afraid of strangers at that point too. So other things that they found included large individual differences in the way that they behaved, so that actually there's a lot of variation between children in the way that they attach. Responsiveness of the caregiver, in this case the mother, was very key to the quality of the attachment, so whether this is strong, whether this is positive, whether this is negative. That often they found that children were attached to more than one person, which is important for later on in the topic. And they also found that crucially, the main caregivers, the person who bathed, fed, changed, etc., was not necessarily the main attachment figure, and this went against the grain, very much so in terms of the research that was available at the time. So from this research they were able to establish some stages. First stage is called the asocial stage, and this is 0 to 6 weeks. So lots of smiling, crying, but it's not really directed at anybody. The indiscriminate phase, which is they want attention, but they want attention from lots of different people, and this happens between 2 to 7 months. Specific attachments, also called the discriminant stage, where there is strong attachment to one individual and there are good attachments to other people. And then finally, multiple attachments, where attachment can be extended to other adults, other people who spend time with child, grandparents, siblings, etc., etc. So a little bit of evaluation just to round these slides off. There are methodological problems with this. So Schaefer and Emerson's study was largely self-report, and therefore this is open to bias because people are people and people lie. But it also had quite high ecological validity. Because of this, they were having a look at attachment in real life, real situations, and therefore it maintained ecological validity quite nicely. So just to finish off then, here is some useful reading in terms of looking at caregiver and infant interactions, and obviously have a little look at your textbooks as well. There's always some useful things and useful studies in that. And hopefully you've been taking notes during this. If you have not, then now is perhaps the time to stop and go back through your notes and make some notes of key terms in your glossaries, key studies, and get yourself ready for your lesson in class, please. Okay, thank you very much. See you in lesson.